The sound was wrong. It wasn't the familiar crunch of snow under a deer's hoof, nor the sharp crack of a frozen branch giving way. It was a faint, rhythmic scraping, punctuated by a low, guttural whine that the wind almost swallowed. It was a sound of desperate, failing effort. Arthur Jenkins paused, his own breath pluming in the frigid Montana air. The sound pulled at something ancient in him. It was the sound of a life trying not to end. He adjusted the pack on his back, his 72-year-old knees protesting the cold, and angled off his usual trap line, following the sound toward the half-frozen river. And then he saw it. It wasn't a log jammed against the ice shelf. It was fur, a vast expanse of it, almost as white as the snow itself, matted and dark with frozen water. A creature, immense and powerful, was caught. One of its front legs was trapped beneath a thick plate of blue-white ice, the angle sickeningly wrong. The animal was exhausted. Its massive head rested on the ice, only lifting every few moments to emit that strained, hopeless whine. As Arthur crept closer, the head lifted again. Two eyes, the color of raw amber, locked onto him. There was no fire in them, no predator's challenge, just a flat, chillingly intelligent gaze that said it knew exactly what he was, and it knew it was going to die right here. The scraping stopped. The whining stopped. There was only the wind, the creak of the ice, and the silent, unblinking stare of a giant timber wolf. Arthur's hand instinctively went to the hunting knife on his belt. Years of living alone in the Bitterroot Mountains had taught him one simple rule. You do not engage with a wolf, especially not one of this size. It was a male, easily topping 150 pounds, a ghost of the forest that was more myth than creature to most people. He had seen their tracks, heard their howls echo through the valleys on winter nights, a wild and lonely song, but he'd never been this close. He should turn around, walk away, let nature run its cruel course. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing to do. But the wolf didn't move. It didn't bare its teeth. Its amber eyes simply held his, a silent plea that transcended species. In that gaze, Arthur saw not a monster, but a fellow living being caught in the indifferent jaws of winter. He saw the fight draining out of it, the slow surrender to the killing cold. He took a deep, steadying breath that stung his lungs. Damn it all, he muttered to the uncaring sky. The decision was made. It wasn't a decision of the mind, but of the soul. He turned back, his movements deliberate. The trek back to his small, secluded cabin was half a mile. But he made it in record time, his mind racing faster than his legs. He ignored the warmth of his hearth, the smell of coffee from the pot he'd left on the stove. He went straight to the woodshed. He grabbed his heaviest axe, its edge honed to a razor sharpness. He found a length of thick rope and two old, coarse horse blankets. Tools of a woodsman, tools he would now use for a task more reckless than any he had ever undertaken. When he returned to the riverbank, the wolf was in the same position, a statue of frozen misery. Its eyes, however, followed his every move. Arthur didn't approach its head. He gave the powerful jaws a wide berth, circling around to the trapped limb. He could see the problem clearly now. The wolf must have been crossing the river where the ice was thin. It broke through, and in its frantic scramble to get out, its paws slipped under the main ice shelf. As the water refroze, it tightened its grip. The bone was almost certainly broken. "All right, big fella," Arthur grunted, more to himself than to the animal. "Let's see about this." He laid the blankets on the snow nearby. He took his stance, feet planted wide on the slick surface. The first swing of the axe sent a shockwave through the ice. A spiderweb of cracks appeared. The wolf flinched, a low growl rumbling in its chest. a faint echo of its former power. "Easy now," Arthur said, his voice a low, calm baritone. He didn't look at the wolf's eyes. He focused on the task. Chip, chip, crack. He worked with a lifetime of experience, not trying to shatter the ice sheet, but to methodically carve a channel around the trapped leg. Water, black and frigid, welled up with each strike. His boots were soaked. His gloves were stiffening with ice. But he didn't stop. The wolf watched, silent now. It seemed to understand, or perhaps it was simply too weak to protest. After 20 minutes of grueling work, a large chunk of the ice shelf broke away with a loud groan, freeing the leg. The wolf made no move to get up. It simply slumped further onto the ice, its freed leg lying limp and mangled. It was alive, but only just. The rapid breathing had slowed to shallow, infrequent puffs of steam. Arthur knew it wouldn't last another hour out here. The cold would finish what the trap had started. He looked at the cabin, then back at the enormous, inert predator. He was bringing it home. The sheer insanity of the thought almost made him laugh. He was an old man. He lived alone, and he was about to haul a potentially lethal carnivore back to his sanctuary. He wrapped the thick ropes under the wolf's body, creating a crude harness. The animal was a dead weight. Grunting with effort, Arthur began to drag it. The journey back was a slow, brutal agony. The wolf's body slid over the snow, leaving a shallow trough. Every few yards, Arthur had to stop, his heart hammering against his ribs, his old muscles screaming. The wolf's head lolled to the side, its amber eyes closed. Once, a low moan escaped its throat, a sound of pure misery that spurred Arthur on. He didn't take it into the cabin. That was a line even his compassion wouldn't let him cross. He dragged the wolf into the dry, relative warmth of the woodshed and onto the bed of old blankets he'd prepared. The air in the small space was thick with the wild, musky scent of the animal, the smell of wet fur and cold blood. He lit the small cast-iron stove in the corner, and a welcome wave of heat began to push back the chill. He knelt cautiously. The wolf's leg was a mess. The steel jaws of an illegal trap, likely set by poachers, were still clamped tight around the bone, hidden beneath the fur. The ice had frozen the metal to the flesh. The wolf was unconscious, or so close to it that it didn't matter. Arthur worked quickly, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle. He managed to pry the cruel trap open. He cleaned the wound as best he could with antiseptic from his own first aid kit, hissing in sympathy as he saw the extent of the damage. He wrapped the leg tightly with clean rags. He placed a bowl of fresh water and a plate of venison from his own stores near the wolf's head. There was nothing more he could do. He backed out of the woodshed, pulled the heavy wooden doors shut, and slid the thick iron bolt into place. Night fell fast and hard. A blizzard descended from the mountains, howling and throwing sheets of snow against his cabin. Arthur sat in his armchair by the fire, a rifle across his lap, listening. The world was reduced to the roar of the wind and the crackle of the flames. For hours there was silence from the shed. He must have been wrong. The wolf was too far gone. It had died. A strange sadness settled over him. Then he heard it. It started as a faint scraping of claws on the wooden floor. Then, a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A low, deep, guttural growl. It wasn't the whine of a dying creature. It was the sound of a cornered predator. A rumble of contained fury that vibrated through the floorboards of his own cabin. The wolf was awake, and it knew it was in a cage. The deep, vibrating growl was not a sound of pain. It was a declaration of presence, a promise of violence that seemed to make the very floorboards of Arthur's cabin tremble. He sat frozen in his chair, the warmth from the fireplace doing nothing to stop the chill that had taken root deep in his bones. The rifle felt heavy and useless in his lap. The blizzard shrieked outside, a wild chorus to the fury contained in his woodshed. For the first time in 30 years of living in this unforgiving wilderness, Arthur felt like a trespasser in his own home. He had not brought a victim into his sanctuary. He had brought a king into his territory, and the king was waking up. The growling continued for what felt like an eternity, rising and falling in intensity. It was the sound of a powerful engine turning over, sputtering with pain, but still capable of immense destructive force. Arthur didn't move. He simply listened. A lone man in a wooden box, held captive by the storm outside and the beast a few dozen feet away. He finally drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep in his chair, the growl a constant threat in his subconscious. He woke to silence. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world buried and glistening under a thick blanket of new snow. The sun was brilliant, the air sharp and clean. But the silence from the woodshed was more unnerving than the growling had been. Had the wolf exhausted itself? Had the wound and the cold finally claimed it? A part of him, the rational part that had screamed at him not to get involved, felt a pang of relief. The other part, the stubborn, foolishly compassionate part, felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, his movements slow and stiff. He didn't take the rifle. If the wolf was dead, he didn't need it. If it was alive and wanted him dead, a rifle inside the cramped woodshed would be more of a hindrance than a help. He approached the shed door as if it were the gate to a dragon's lair. He put his ear to the rough-hewn wood. Nothing. No breathing, no scraping, no growling. There was a small, high window on the side of the shed, covered by a shutter. Arthur trudged through the deep snow, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He carefully unlatched the shutter and peered through the grimy glass. The interior was dark, but his eyes adjusted. The wolf was alive. It was in the far corner, as far from the door as it could get. It wasn't lying down. It was propped up against the wall of stacked firewood. Standing unsteadily on 3 legs, its injured limb held clear of the floor. Its head was up, its ears were pricked, and its amber eyes were fixed directly on the window, on him. There was no fear in that gaze, only a cold, burning intensity, an unwavering, intelligent watchfulness. The bowls of water and venison he had left sat untouched near the door. The animal's pride and suspicion were stronger than its thirst or hunger. It would rather die than accept help from a potential threat. "All right, Your Majesty," Arthur murmured to the glass. "Have it your way." He closed the shutter and went back to the door. He knew he couldn't go in. That would be suicide. He returned to his cabin and came back with a fresh bowl of water and more meat. Kneeling in the snow, he slowly, deliberately, slid the heavy wooden bolt back. The sound was deafeningly loud in the silence. From inside, there was a sharp huff of air, but no growl. Arthur opened the door just a crack, no more than a few inches. He slid the bowls inside, pushing them across the wooden floor with a long stick. The wolf watched the bowls slide to a stop 10 feet away from it. It didn't move. Its eyes flickered from the bowls to the crack in the door, where it could surely see his shape. Arthur backed away, closed the door, and shot the bolt home. He did not feel like a savior. He felt like a jailer. This became their ritual. For 3 days, the world was a silent tableau of white snow and blue sky. Twice a day, Arthur would bring fresh food and water. He would unbolt the door, slide the offerings inside, and secure the shed again. He started talking to the wolf, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Still holding out, are you? Stubborn as a mule. Or, water's fresh from the well, better than that dirty river." He talked about the weather, about the deer tracks he saw, about the wood he needed to chop. He filled the silence with the sound of his voice, hoping to make it a familiar, non-threatening part of the wolf's new reality. He never looked through the window again. He gave the wolf its privacy. Every morning, when he brought the new bowls, the old ones were empty. The meat was gone, the water drunk. The wolf was eating, but only when it was certain it was alone under the cover of darkness. It was a truce of a sort. A fragile agreement negotiated across a locked door. On the fourth day, something changed. Arthur brought the morning meal as usual. He slid the bolt, opened the crack, and prepared to push the bowls inside. But he paused. The wolf was not in the far corner. It was lying in the middle of the shed, its head on its paws, watching the door. It was still a good 15 feet away, but it hadn't retreated. It held its ground. Arthur pushed the bowl of meat in. It slid to a stop much closer to the wolf than before. Arthur waited, crouched in the snow, his eye to the crack. The wolf lifted its head. It sniffed the air. Its amber eyes met Arthur's. A long moment passed, a silent conversation of intent and instinct. Then, deliberately, the wolf pushed itself up onto its 3 good legs. It limped forward, one slow step at a time, never taking its eyes off the door. It reached the bowl. It lowered its head, and with Arthur watching, it began to eat. A profound and powerful feeling washed over Arthur. It was not ownership. It was acceptance. A wild creature, the very embodiment of distrust, had chosen to trust him enough to show a moment of vulnerability. The progress gave him courage. Too much courage. The next afternoon, he decided the makeshift bandage on the wolf's leg had to be changed. It had been nearly a week. The wound needed air, and he needed to see if infection had set in. He prepared a new set of clean rags and his jar of salve. This time, he didn't just open the door a crack. He slid the bolt and slowly, deliberately, pulled the heavy door open wide enough to slip through. He left it open behind him, a clear path of escape for both of them. "Easy now, fella," he said softly, holding the clean rags out in his open hand so the wolf could see he was unarmed. "Just want to take a look. Just want to help." The wolf had been resting. Now it was on its feet in an instant. The faint, fragile trust of the morning vanished as if it had never existed. A low rumble started deep in its chest, a sound 100 times more menacing than the growls from the first night. Its hackles rose, the fur along its spine standing up straight. Its lips peeled back from its gums, revealing long, yellow-white canines designed for one purpose: to tear and to kill. Arthur froze, halfway inside the shed. He had made a terrible mistake. The wolf took a halting step forward, its massive body trembling with a mixture of pain and pure, unadulterated rage. Its amber eyes were no longer watchful. They were blazing with a lethal fire that gave a single, crystal-clear message. He had crossed the line from keeper to invader, and the penalty was death. The world narrowed to the space between Arthur and the wolf. The air, thick with the scent of pine shavings and raw animal fury, was a physical presence. Every instinct in Arthur's 72-year-old body screamed at him to turn and run. But a lifetime in the wild had taught him one vital lesson. You never turn your back on a cornered predator. Running would trigger the chase, a primal switch that even the wolf's mangled leg might not override. He had to undo his mistake. He had to become small. He stopped moving forward. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the clean rags and the jar of salvie to the floor, his eyes never leaving the wolf's. He did not, however, hold the stare. He broke eye contact, glancing away to the side, a gesture of submission, of non-confrontation. "My mistake," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "My mistake, big fella. I'm sorry." The wolf did not lunge, but it did not relax. The growl was a constant, solid thing, a wall of sound between them. It shifted its weight on its 3 good legs, a subtle movement that spoke of coiled power. The bared teeth glistened. Arthur began to back away. He moved 1 foot, then the other, a glacial retreat. He didn't bend to pick up the rags he had dropped. His movements were fluid, non-threatening. He was no longer a man invading a space. He was a shadow receding. The wolf's eyes followed him, 2 burning amber coals in the gloom of the shed. It tracked his every inch of retreat. When Arthur's back finally touched the open door frame, he felt a wave of relief so profound, his knees almost buckled. He slipped sideways through the opening, never turning his back, and pulled the heavy door shut. The click of the wood settling into the frame was loud. The sound of the heavy iron bolt sliding home was the sound of his own heart restarting. He leaned his forehead against the cold, rough wood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had been inches from death, and he knew it. The trust he had so carefully, painstakingly built over the past week was gone, shattered in a single, arrogant moment. He didn't approach the shed for the rest of the day. He left the wolf to its rage and its solitude. When evening came, he left a bowl of water and a generous portion of meat by the bolted door, a silent, useless offering. The next morning, it was untouched. The wolf was punishing him, or it was too agitated to eat. Either way, the message was clear. He had violated the treaty, and the embassy was closed. For 2 more days, the food and water sat there, freezing solid overnight and being replaced by fresh offerings in the morning. Arthur's heart grew heavier with each passing day. The wolf would starve itself out of sheer pride. The infection in its leg would fester. He would find it dead one morning, a magnificent creature defeated not by the wild, but by his own foolishness. He had not saved it. He had only prolonged its suffering and given it a cage to die in. The thought was a bitter pill. On the 3rd morning after the confrontation, he found the bowls empty. He knelt in the snow, a surge of hope making him feel lightheaded. The wolf had eaten. The silent treatment was over. It had chosen survival. But Arthur knew he was back to square one. He could not go inside. He could not check the wound. He was reduced to being a faceless provider, pushing food through a crack in a door. The wolf would either heal on its own, or it would die. That afternoon, as he sat by his fire, an idea began to form. It was a long shot, born of desperation. If he couldn't get close to the wolf, he had to make his presence a source of comfort, not threat. He couldn't use his hands to treat it, but maybe he could use his scent to calm it. He took an old flannel shirt he had worn for the past 2 days, a shirt that was saturated with the smell of wood smoke, coffee, and old man. That evening, when he brought the food, he did something different. He opened the door crack, pushed the bowls of food and water inside with his stick, and then he pushed the folded-up shirt in after them, leaving it a few feet from the food. He said nothing. He just closed the door, bolted it, and walked away, feeling utterly foolish. The wolf would likely ignore it, or tear it to shreds as a proxy for the man it now hated. The next morning, the food was gone. The shirt lay untouched, a small plaid island on the wooden floor. He did the same the next night, and the night after that. The food was always eaten. the shirt always ignored. He was about to give up on the idea. But on the morning of the 7th day of this new, fragile routine, he saw it. The food bowl was empty, as expected, but the shirt was gone. He scanned the floor of the shed through the crack. It wasn't ripped. It wasn't in a corner. It was simply gone. His heart hammered. He hurried to the small shuttered window on the side of the shed, his breath misting the cold glass as he peered in. The wolf was in its usual corner, curled up on the pile of old horse blankets, and tucked carefully beside its body, partially underneath its massive head like a pillow, was his red and black flannel shirt. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been adopted. The wolf had taken his scent, his very essence, and brought it into its den. It was a gesture so profound, so contrary to every law of the wild, that Arthur could barely process it. Feeling a surge of boldness, he went back to the door and slowly, quietly, slid the bolt open. He didn't open it wide, just the familiar crack he used for feeding. He peeked inside. The wolf heard the sound, its head lifted from the shirt, its amber eyes locked on him. For a second, he saw the muscles in its shoulders tense, and he prepared for the inevitable growl. But it didn't come. Instead, the wolf let out a low, guttural noise. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a whine. It was a deep, vibrating rumble, a sound that seemed to hold a question. And then, as the wolf shifted its position, Arthur saw it. He saw the leg. He had been so focused on the wolf's behavior that he hadn't truly looked. The makeshift bandage of rags had long since fallen away. The wound around the ankle was no longer just red and swollen. It was angry, discolored, and oozing a sickly fluid. Dark, ugly streaks, like veins of poison, were creeping up the wolf's leg from the mangled paw, visible even under the thick fur. Blood poisoning. Sepsis. It was advancing, and it was advancing fast. The wolf had finally given him a sign of trust, but Arthur realized with a jolt of ice-cold dread, it may have done so just as its body had begun to irreversibly shut down. This is part 3 of approximately 5. Type continuation for the next part. Continuation 23rd December 2025 2:23. The sight of those dark, venomous streaks sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Arthur, sharper than any fear he'd felt before. This wasn't a noble wound anymore. It was rot. A systemic poison that was actively shutting the wolf down from the inside out. The flannel shirt, the tentative trust, the shared meals. It was all for nothing if that infection reached the animal's heart. And Arthur knew, with the grim certainty of a man who had seen gangrene in the field, that it was a matter of hours, not days. There was no more time for caution. There was no more negotiation across a wooden door. The choice was brutally simple. Go in there and fight the infection, or stand by and watch the wolf die a slow, agonizing death in his shed. He pulled the door shut, slid the bolt, and turned not toward his cabin, but toward the small, lean-to greenhouse he kept attached to the southern wall. This was beyond his simple first aid kit. He worked with a frantic, focused energy. From his carefully tended collection of medicinal herbs, he grabbed dried yarrow to stop bleeding, calendula for its anti-inflammatory properties, and most importantly, a precious, tightly sealed jar of usnea. The old man's beard lichen was a powerful natural antibiotic, a secret of the deep woods he'd used before on himself for deep cuts that refused to heal. He crushed the herbs into a potent poultice, adding a splash of hot water to make a thick, fragrant paste. He gathered his sharpest, cleanest knife, a bottle of strong peroxide, and a roll of clean bandages. He was preparing for surgery. As he worked, He could hear a sound from the shed, a low, continuous whimpering. The wolf's pride had finally broken, drowned out by the rising tide of pain and fever. It was the sound of a creature that knew it was dying. Arthur took a deep breath, holding the tray of supplies. This was it. He walked to the shed, his boots crunching in the snow. He didn't hesitate. He slid the bolt and swung the door wide open, flooding the dark interior with bright, unforgiving sunlight. The wolf was lying on its side, panting in shallow, rapid breaths. Its magnificent amber eyes were glazed with fever. It saw him, and a low growl, weak and pathetic, rattled in its chest. It tried to push itself up, but collapsed back onto the blankets, its body trembling uncontrollably. It was too weak to fight, too weak to run. Arthur had his chance, and it was a gift born of misery. "I know, fella. I know it hurts," Arthur said, his voice low and steady. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the shed and knelt beside the enormous animal. He could feel the heat coming off the wolf's body in waves. The smell of the infection was stronger now, a sickly sweet and metallic odor that turned his stomach. "I'm going to try to help you. You just got to let me." He set the tray down. The wolf watched his every move, its head lifting an inch off the floor before slumping back down. A tremor ran through its frame. Arthur reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and placed it on the wolf's flank, far from the wound. The fur was coarse and hot. The wolf flinched but did not snap. It whined, a high, desperate sound. He took that as permission. He started with the peroxide. He knew it would hurt. He poured a small amount directly onto the swollen, mangled paw. The reaction was immediate and violent. The liquid foamed white, hissing as it attacked the bacteria. The wolf let out a strangled yelp, and its body convulsed, its powerful muscles clenching in agony. Its head whipped around, and for a terrifying second, its jaws gaped open, teeth inches from Arthur's arm. But it was a reflex, not an attack. The wolf's eyes were squeezed shut, its entire being consumed by the searing pain. Arthur held his ground, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Easy, easy, son. It's got to be done." He worked quickly now, using a clean rag to wipe away the pus and filth the peroxide had loosened. He had to expose the source. He found it near the broken bone. 2 deep puncture wounds from the trap's teeth, now cavernous and black around the edges. With grim determination, he took his knife. He heated the tip in the flame of a lighter until it glowed red, sterilizing it. He had to open the wounds wider to drain the poison that was trapped deep inside. He murmured apologies to the animal as he made 2 quick, decisive cuts. A torrent of dark, foul-smelling fluid erupted from the leg. The wolf screamed. It was not a howl or a growl, but a raw, piercing scream of pure agony that echoed in the small shed and tore at Arthur's soul. Its body thrashed, but the movement was weak, uncoordinated. Arthur held the leg firm, pressing down, forcing more of the infection out. He ignored the scream, focusing on the task, his face a mask of concentration. He flushed the wounds again with peroxide, then packed them with the thick green poultice of usnea and calendula. The wolf had gone limp beneath his hands, its breathing ragged and shallow. Finally, he wrapped the entire leg, from paw to elbow, in clean, tight bandages. It was done. He was drenched in sweat, his hands shaking, his body aching from the tension. He looked down at the wolf. Its eyes were closed. Its chest rose and fell in faint, stuttering movements. He had put it through hell. He had inflicted terrible pain on a creature that had only just begun to trust him. He reached out and gently stroked the massive head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur of its ruff. "It's over now," he whispered. It's over. You just rest." The wolf did not respond. Its breathing seemed to grow even fainter. Arthur's brief sense of accomplishment curdled into a new, more terrible fear. He leaned closer, putting his ear near the wolf's muzzle, desperate to feel a steady breath. But the shallow puff of air he'd felt before was gone. He felt nothing. The wolf's body gave a sudden, violent shudder, a full-body convulsion that threw Arthur's hand from its head. Then it went utterly, unnaturally still. Its chest was no longer moving at all. Arthur stared in horror. The pain and shock of the treatment had been too much. He hadn't saved the wolf. He had just killed it faster. Silence. The only sound in the shed was the frantic, useless thumping of Arthur's own heart. He stared at the still, magnificent form, a monument of gray fur and failed hope. A cold that had nothing to do with the Montana winter seeped into his bones. He had failed. He had taken this wild, proud creature, subjected it to the terror of captivity, inflicted excruciating pain upon it. And for what? To preside over its death in a dusty woodshed. He slumped back on his heels, the tools on the tray forgotten. The weight of his 72 years pressed down on him, each one a testament to a life lived in harmony with the wild, a life whose creed he had just violated in the most fundamental way. He should have left it. He should have walked away that first day and let the river have it. That would have been a clean death, a death by nature. This was a dirty death, a death by hubris. His hubris. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the wolf's neck, half expecting the fur to already feel cool. He closed his eyes, a silent apology passing from man to beast. And then he felt it, so faint it was almost imperceptible. A tiny, warm puff of air against the back of his hand, a ghost of a breath. His eyes snapped open. He leaned in close, his ear hovering over the wolf's black lips. Nothing. Then again, a shallow, barely there flutter in the animal's chest, followed by another whisper of breath. It was alive. It was in the deepest pit of shock, its body hovering on the very knife's edge between life and death. But it was alive. A surge of desperate energy electrified Arthur. He scrambled back to the cabin, grabbing every remaining blanket he owned. He returned and gently, carefully, packed them around the wolf's inert body, trying to preserve every last flicker of warmth. He stoked the small iron stove in the corner of the shed until it glowed a dull red, turning the small space into a sauna. He sat on the floor beside the wolf, a silent vigil. There was nothing more to be done. The poultice was on. The infection was drained. Now it was a battle between the wolf's will to live and the poison still running in its veins. For 2 days and 2 nights, Arthur barely left the shed. He slept on a pile of hay in the corner, waking every hour to check the wolf's breathing and to offer water with a small spoon, most of which dribbled uselessly from the side of its mouth. The wolf was a living furnace, burning with fever. It shivered and twitched in its deep unconsciousness, sometimes letting out low moans of pain that tore at Arthur's heart. He talked to it constantly, a low, soothing monologue. He told it about the coming spring, about the elk herds that would soon descend from the high country, about the strength in its bones. He willed it to live with the sheer force of his own voice. On the 3rd morning, he awoke to a change. The oppressive heat of fever radiating from the wolf's body had lessened. He laid a hand on its forehead and found it was still hot, but no longer burning. He looked down and saw 2 amber eyes, no longer glazed and distant, but cloudy and confused, looking at him. The wolf was awake. It was too weak to move, too weak to even lift its head. But it was aware. Arthur gently unwrapped the bandages on its leg. The swelling had gone down by half. The angry red skin was now a healthier pink, and the ugly black streaks of sepsis were visibly receding. The poultice had worked its magic. The wolf's body, freed from the immediate threat of poison, was beginning to heal. He carefully cleaned the wound and applied a fresh, lighter dressing. As he worked, the wolf watched him, its gaze unwavering. There was no growl, no baring of teeth. There was only a profound, weary stillness. When he was done, Arthur brought a bowl of thin broth, rich with boiled venison. He propped the wolf's heavy head up with one hand and brought the bowl to its muzzle. The wolf sniffed it, its nose twitching. Then, its tongue tentatively emerged and took a weak lap. It took another and another. It drank the entire bowl. It was the first true turning point. The days that followed blurred into a routine of quiet care. The wolf's strength returned with astonishing speed. First, it was able to lift its head on its own. Then, it could push itself into a sitting position, its bandaged leg held carefully off the floor. Arthur continued to talk to it, and the wolf would watch, its ears twitching, its head cocked as if it understood every word. The fear was gone. The aggression was gone. In its place was something else, something Arthur had never expected. One afternoon, as Arthur changed the dressing, he fumbled, his old fingers stiff from the cold. The wolf, which had been patiently waiting, let out a soft huff and nudged his hand with its nose. It was a gentle, deliberate gesture, an encouragement. Another day, as Arthur sat on the floor, leaning his tired back against the firewood, the wolf limped the few feet from its bed of blankets and lay down beside him, not touching, but close enough that Arthur could feel the warmth of its body. It rested its head on its paws and let out a deep sigh, a sound of contentment. They sat like that for an hour. Two old survivors, one human, one wild, sharing the quiet of a winter afternoon. Weeks turned into a month. The wound healed, leaving a puckered, hairless scar around the wolf's ankle. The limp, at first pronounced, slowly faded until it was almost unnoticeable. The wolf's full power had returned. Its coat grew thick and glossy, its eyes bright and clear. It began to pace the confines of the shed, its movements no longer weak, but a fluid, predatory grace. It was restless. The call of the wild, suppressed by pain and dependency, was singing in its blood again. Arthur saw it. He knew their time together was ending. The shed was no longer a hospital. It was a cage. One bright, cold morning, when the sun was melting the last of the snow and the air smelled of damp earth and coming spring, Arthur went to the shed. He did not bring food. He simply slid the bolt and swung the door wide open. He stood back. "Well, fella," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I reckon it's time." The wolf stood in the center of the shed, looking at the open door, at the vast, beckoning forest beyond. It looked at Arthur, a long, deep, unreadable look. It took a step toward the door, then paused, turning back to him. It walked to where Arthur stood, and for the first and only time, it leaned forward and licked his chapped, wrinkled hand. Then, without a sound, it turned, and with a power and grace that took Arthur's breath away, it trotted out of the shed, across the clearing, and vanished into the shadows of the pines. Arthur stood there for a long time, the phantom warmth of the wolf's tongue on his skin. He was alone again. That night, as a full moon rose over the jagged peaks, a sound echoed through the valley. It was not a sound of pain or loneliness. It was a long, clear, powerful howl, a song of freedom. Arthur stepped out onto his porch and listened, and he smiled. After everything they went through, should Arthur have tried to keep the wolf? Or was letting it go back to the wild the only right choice?